Hello and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. I am Joe Rockey here with Father Boniface. And Father, today I want to talk about something that is pretty essential to the Catholic faith that I am fairly certain that I have misunderstood or at least don't fully understand what it is that's meant by taking the sins away from the world, redeeming us from sin. And again, I am not a theologian by any stretch. You certainly are, and I'm not. But I come at this from just living a practical sense. And yes, sin is a violation of the relationship that you have with God. And you can do it directly with God that has little ripple effects to direct relationships with other people within your house. That's one category of sin. But there is also the category of sin of hurting other people and not living up to the way you're supposed to with those direct relationships. An example might be someone cheats upon their spouse. That's certainly the sin of adultery. Well, you can go to confession and you can have that sin removed through the faith, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship with your spouse is any better. And I use this as an example to say that when we sin, we still are causing harm. And that my question is what is actually meant when it says remove the sins of the world? And what is the impact that has upon us? Because I'm almost 100% certain I'm taking the part 2 for granted. And I wanted to talk about that in today's episode.
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. We use that phrase a lot, and it can be kind of confusing, and it can lead to other ideas about what that means. And so, I really appreciate bringing that up. What does sin do? And we can go back to the original model in the garden model. Anyway, the original sin in the garden. The distrust in God, and we could say that, kind of the root of that is not trusting that God is a good father who wants to provide the things that we need for happiness, for fulfillment. And so he's holding out on us. That's the temptation. And then we choose by sin to take for ourselves. And that's what Adam and Eve do by eating the forbidden fruit, is choose to disbelieve God, disobey him, and take for ourselves that which he is not ready to give us, let's say it that way. So, and what does that do? It causes a lot of rupture. So with that sin, Adam hides himself from God. He had previously been walking with God in the garden. Now he is aware of his nakedness and he is filled with shame. He hides himself from God. He blames Eve and he blames the tempter. And Eve blames the tempter, and Adam even blames God, really, the woman you put here with me. So we see all of this rupture that takes place when we disbelieve and disobey God. You put a little bookmark right on that. We can talk about what disbelieving and disobeying God is more broadly. But the when that happens, we have that rupture, and then part of the consequence of that is that man now has to toil for his food, and his work is no longer sweet as it was, but now it has this dimension of sweat, the sweat of his brow. And so there's a kind of rupture with creation as well. Creation also suffers from man's sin. There's so there's a rupture among humanity, there's a rupture with creation, and there's a rupture with God, and then ultimately there's a rupture within man himself. So again, that shame and hiding is and now his shame over his transparency. He wants to protect himself and no longer wants to be naked, transparent, vulnerable. So all of that rupture takes place. So at the very least, we could say, well, that's not good. How do we make that better? How do we repair the rupture? What's necessary to repair the rupture? well, just get over it, and like behave as if it didn't happen. Well, that doesn't really work. It damages us at an ontological level, and it damages us to the core of our being. Um, and furthermore, there's a kind of justice that's baked in. We don't get to just do whatever we want, and it doesn't matter. So that would be, just to say like, okay, it's okay. It doesn't really matter. Just keep going and try again. Do better next time, as if there were nothing. No, when we break something, there's an indebtedness in our relationship to God. So there's a need for justice. There's a need for social repair. There's a need for rebuilding trust. There's a need for inner healing, and then in some sense we need to be restored to right worship. So that's again part of justice. We've turned our attention away from God. So what does all of that? $1 million, a clever word, and that's where we see something about suffering. So there's a redemptive quality to our suffering. Suffering the consequences has some kind of redemptive quality, but ultimately we can't sort of do enough. And so although God keeps trying to provide right ordering, he provides a relationship with Noah, and then with Abraham, and then ultimately with Moses or Israel, and Moses, and so we have these sequences of covenants in which God is trying to restore right order, like at least stop hurting each other. If we can at least contain the sin to a certain degree, that would be a step in the right direction. So that's part of what happens, and then that's happening in the context of relationship. But ultimately, what's necessary to heal everything is for a love to enter into all of those most wounded places, all of the rupture, for a love to share in the suffering, that the suffering, the consequences of sin, the rupture itself, becomes a pathway to communion. And so that's where God totally enters into our situation in love, brings us into relationship with himself, not just in general, but specifically in the areas that we have failed, in the areas of our sin, basically embraces the sinner, and then love shares in the consequences, and actually sort of supports us. We don't have to deliver the full justice of our failures, because Christ, in some sense, substitutes in his own work for us, in his own suffering, in his own self-sacrificing love, substitutes for some of that, and pays back. He restores justice, brings us into right relationship. And what happens is, in the process, now I'm going beyond what is necessary to redeem sin, is in the process, he actually unites us with his own nature. So he raises us to a new level of being, now a divinized level of being. So let me back up again and say that all again. After the rupture and damage, the injustice and debt that is incurred by man's disobedience and disbelief, love is the power that redeems and heals, restores justice. And because that the only sufficient love, we could say, to do all of that is divine, that divine love actually transforms us into itself and unites us with him. So Christ's process of redeeming sin has also brought us to a new level of relationship with him and a new level of being in the process. But anyway, that's hopefully a bit of a robust enough description of what redemption looks like, taking away the sin of the world.
It certainly was robust, and I think that I caught a theme in there that I might be worth exploring here, especially since this is coming out during Advent, is that going back to your bookmark in the beginning, as you said there, was Adam wasn't ready to receive what God was going to fully develop. And we kind of see that narrative throughout the Old Testament. God in a lot of the books, especially in the ones earlier in the Old Testament, there's a lot of violence. There's wars, there's the Israelites going to battle. That's what Moses does. You got all the plagues, you got Joshua going to war. A lot of different battles happen. But all of them are kind of taking a step towards, now I can trust you a little bit more. Now you're doing a little bit better. Now you're allowed to at least see the Holy Land, Moses. Now your next generation goes in. They try to do a little bit better. Obviously, it's not a pure linear road. There are setbacks. But overall, stepping back from it, much like looking at a grid of the stock market, it's kind of going up. There's zigzags down, meaning setbacks, but in general, we're going in the right direction. And then obviously the New Testament is Christ entering into the world. That, as I mentioned in the previous episode, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, that the world wasn't ready for him either when he came. And I think that, as you said, the goal of saving the world from sin, the reason what sin is blocking us from is being truly united with God. And all these different ways in which we hurt people, hurt ourselves, hurt relationships at the end of the day are breaking away. And how we are called to try to bridge these gaps to be better than it was before. And it's continual progress of trying to become closer to God, both as individuals and as a group, as a society, as a church. So that was kind of one of the themes I took away from you there. And the acknowledgement of what you said is that there's going to be hardship, both from the person who commits the sin and the person who the sin is offensed against. That's something the way that it is. And having a 4-year-old seeing how to teach this is something that you see a lot. He knows he did something wrong and he doesn't want to have it exposed to the light of the day. But likewise, there's something broken or someone's crying because he tackled his brother or whatever the case might be. It has to be addressed, and it can't just be, oh, this is okay, go from there. And I think that trying to look at that terminology that we say during church or during Mass, to wash away the sins of the world, doesn't take away all the stuff that you just mentioned. There's still the hardship. There's still a broken relationship. That's step one, is him outpouring his love so that we can. But we still have to. This isn't a passive experience. This isn't watching the Super Bowl from your couch. This is out there being involved, trying to make a difference. And that was kind of the overall theme that I took from your very robust answer. And I want to see, if it's what you intended or if I just took this in a completely different direction and missed some of your points.
No, you brought out some great things. I want to say one thing a little bit differently. You said Adam wasn't ready for what God wanted to do. So that's actually not true, because Adam was in a state of grace. He was in perfect relationship with God, in perfect relationship with Eve, and in perfect relationship with creation. There were no problems, and he was ready. He had a developmental path. It would be like saying Jesus wasn't ready to die on the cross when he was a newborn infant. Well, that you could say it in that way, in the sense that, but he's on a path of growth and development that doesn't require redemption. That's just the natural path of human growth. But Adam's sin is a mystery. So in the perfect circumstances, in a state of grace, with no sin and no concupiscence, how did he fall? So that is a mystery. It is the possibility of free will, but it's impossible to understand, really. Anyway, but just to say, God didn't create Adam. He didn't stack the deck against him. Adam wasn't required to sin. Sin did not need to be a part of creation. So now I know that wasn't your point, but really you meant fallen Adam then was not ready. So it was sort of like, if you want to do that stock market analogy of the charts, Adam was really already coasting towards moving towards, just moving from glory to glory, moving from perfection to perfection, growing as Jesus would have grown from an infant to an adult, but still always in grace. And then Adam took a precipitous plummet off a cliff by choosing to sin. And now God kind of comes in and actually, so he bakes in a consequence for it, which is the hardship and suffering, which is the work that's involved. You said that beautifully. It's not a spectator sport. God created us without us, but he redeems us only with us, is a fun way to say that. And so, and what's the process of redemption? Well, it's the remedy for the fall. Why did he fall? He didn't trust that God is a good father and would provide for him all that he needs for happiness and fulfillment. And so what does he have to learn to do now through work and suffering and toil? He has to learn to trust. And so God entering into a new kind of relationship with Adam, now not just as creator, but also as savior and redeemer, at least the beginning parts of it at the beginning, starts to move him in a path. And then I would say that, Adam and God together and their subsequent generations are starting to make a little bit of progress forward. And then there's like a precipitous decline, though, because there isn't sort of enough. Although there's some kind of progress, it's going to continually head to decline. And then there's a bump up in really an insertion of grace and being able to lift them up again. And then there's a sort of steady decline again, you could say, a lifting up and a steady decline. And then with the entrance of Christ, now the uplift is within us. And so there's a way that grace now continually helps us to elevate our own ups and downs, now can have kind of a more of a steady growth than the more halting patterns of it in the Old Testament, as things were anyway, not sustained.
Can I jump in with a question there? As I've never really done this kind of a deep dive into Adam before, and this question just kind of popped into my mind, and maybe a little bit of a theory there too. It never says how old Adam is, and you're talking about there's no reason to go into sin aside from you have free will. And my question is, if it does say how old Adam is that could be an indicator there, but it also seems to be like that's a natural thing that happens in people's lives. It probably happens with all genders, but obviously being a guy, I know that side of the fence, that there's a certain point when you just feel you have to do things your way and go out on your own, etc. And there's a third party, regardless of who it was, said, try this different way, regardless of what you think it is. And then using modern equivalents, you then introduce the woman. So now there's sex involved, and so many conflicting things. And then eventually a bad answer gets made. And it almost feels like that's part of where this free will element goes sideways, is that it doesn't matter how perfect things were. Not every decision is going to be made the way that you wanted it to be made from God's perspective. That's why my question there is, because it almost feels like that when you back up and look at it from today's context. Now, granted, we're looking in a pre-fallen world and a post-fallen world, but it seems that could be a human nature translation.
Sorry, say that.
Well, basically, my question is that it never says how old Adam is. Like they're very clear with some of the other prophets. Like Abraham was old. Like they make that known, but they don't really ever say how old Adam was. And some of it seems like someone who's in that developmental stage, as you said, that he's no longer a child, but he's not an adult either. He's in that in between phase where you can be swayed in a lot of different directions when there's a whole lot of new different things afoot that didn't used to be. There's different opinions. There's now women, all this stuff that he didn't have earlier in his development, using your word. that appear in the narrative of the story that lead prior, or maybe lead is the right word, to the downfall and eating the fruit.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What human development would be like for Adam? Because there's no death, age becomes a little bit of a different concept. We normally are measuring age also in terms of decline for the most part. We're moving closer to death, which Adam was not in the garden, moving closer to death. As far as we can tell, there's some different theories around that, but it seems that death was introduced by the envy of the devil. And so, what was, so Adam was not, anyway, it's not really clear what the maturation, human development, those kinds of things. Clearly he's an adult when he's, I don't know, moving through all of paradise and naming all of the animals. Clearly he's an adult when he encounters Eve. But yeah, what all of that means or how that works is an interesting question. How much of human maturation was introduced by the fall? That's an interesting question. I can't think of anybody who's even explored that, but maybe I just wasn't asking the questions and missed it. So,
well, not too often that you're ever going to hear this in nearly 450 episodes that I had a question or father that we didn't have a hard answer for, but that's what we're going to be leaving today's episode with here today, and something for us all to think about. Obviously this episode was about sin and redemption of the world, of how to use God's love to take even the flat out rejection and being banished out of the garden, and how to be able to use God's love to grow, knowing that it's our responsibility to grow more than the previous generation has. And that's what we're called to do, whether it's hard or easy, to use love to help grow and to sin no more. So we thank you all for listening and being with us, and we will be with you again next episode.